A door slammed and the heavy bolt slid shut behind it. An old man stood on the porch with his hand raised to knock again, then slowly let it fall. Cold rain came down in sheets. Beside him stood a small boy, 8 years old, clutching a single cloth bag that held everything the two of them owned in the world. The boy looked up and asked where they would go now. The old man had no answer. His own son had just thrown them both out into the storm, taken the farm, and barred the door against them. His name was Amos Carter, 68 years old, and he had just become homeless with a small boy depending on him. What those two found that night, deep in the forest, would change both their lives forever. It began inside a church that the whole world had forgotten. Stay with me. Amos Carter had built that farm with his own 2 hands 40 years before, and now his own son had locked him out of it. Let me back up because you need to understand how a thing like that happens. Amos had raised 2 sons on that land. The older boy, Daniel, was the good one, steady, kind, hardworking, the kind of man who'd give you the coat off his back. The younger, Frank, was different. Frank had always wanted more than he was willing to earn. Wanted the easy road, the shortcut, the thing that belonged to somebody else. Amos had loved both his boys the way a father does, but he'd never been blind to what Frank was. Daniel married a good woman and they had a son, little Toby. And Daniel worked that farm alongside his father, and everyone understood, though it was never dwelt on, that the land would go to Daniel someday, and then to Toby, on down the line the way a family farm is supposed to go. Then 2 things happened close together that broke the whole world open. First, Toby's mother died of a fever. And then, not a year later, Daniel, good, steady Daniel, was killed when a horse threw him and he struck his head on a stone. Just like that. Gone in an afternoon. And that left old Amos, near 70, suddenly raising his little grandson Toby all alone. A boy who had lost his mother and his father inside of 2 years, and had nobody left in the world but his grandfather. Amos had thrown his whole heart into that boy. Whatever years he had left, he'd decided, belonged to Toby. He'd teach him the land, raise him right, and one day the farm would be Toby's, the way Daniel would have wanted. But Amos wasn't the only one thinking about that farm. Because Frank came back. Frank, the younger son who'd gone off years before chasing one scheme after another, showed up again after Daniel died, wearing a sad face and saying all the right things about family. And Amos, grieving and old and tired, had let him in. Had been glad even to have his surviving son home. He should have known better. Because Frank had not come home out of grief. Frank had come home because Daniel was dead, and a dead brother meant a farm up for grabs, and all that stood between Frank and it was one old man and one small boy. Now here's the thing Amos didn't know yet, the thing that mattered most. Daniel had left a will. A proper one, drawn up with a lawyer in town after his wife died, when he got to thinking about what would happen to Toby if anything happened to him. And that will left the farm, all of it, to his son Toby, with old Amos named as the boy's guardian until he came of age. It was Toby's land. Legally, completely Toby's. Frank had no claim to it at all. None. But Frank had found that will, going through Daniel's things. And Frank had burned it. And then Frank had gone to town and told a different story, that with Daniel dead and no will to be found, the farm passed to the surviving son. To him. He forged some papers. He knew a crooked clerk. And slowly, over months, Frank Carter had maneuvered the deed of that farm into his own name, while a grieving old man was too busy raising a heartbroken little boy to notice what was being stolen right out from under him. And once Frank had the paper that said the farm was his, he didn't need the old man and the boy anymore. He needed them gone. So on a cold, rainy night, Frank Carter and his hard-faced wife Della told Amos the truth of how things now stood. The farm was theirs. The old man and the boy were a burden they had no intention of carrying. And there was the door. Amos had stood in his own front room in the house he built, and could not believe what he was hearing. He'd argued. He'd pleaded, not for himself but for Toby. And Frank had simply had 2 hired men walk them out into the rain with one bag between them and barred the door. And that is how Amos Carter, 68 years old, came to be standing on the porch of his own farm in a storm, with his 8-year-old grandson's hand in his, cast out into the dark with nowhere in the world to go. Toby was shivering. Amos took off his own coat and wrapped it around the boy. "Come on, son," he said with a steadiness he did not feel. "We're not staying where we're not wanted. We'll find shelter. Grandpa's got you." And the 2 of them walked off into the storm. They walked a long time in the rain and the dark. Amos didn't know where they were going. The truth is there was nowhere to go. The nearest town was hours off, and he had no money for an inn even if they reached it. Every neighbor was a friend of the family, which meant a friend of Frank's now too, and Amos had too much pride to go begging on doorsteps in the middle of the night with a story that sounded, even to him, too ugly to be believed. My own son robbed me and threw us out. Who'd credit it? So they walked, mostly to keep warm, the old man and the boy, off the road and into the woods where the trees at least broke the worst of the rain. And that's how they found it.
Deep in the forest, down an overgrown track that hadn't been used in years, Toby spotted it first, a shape in the trees, dark against the darker sky. A building. Amos wiped the rain from his eyes and looked, and slowly it took shape. An old church. A little frontier chapel, the kind circuit preachers used to serve back when this part of the country was first settled, before the town grew up in a different spot and left this one to the forest. Its steeple had half fallen. Its windows were dark and empty. Vines had grown up the walls. It had plainly stood abandoned for many years. But it had walls. And most of a roof. And on a night like that, walls and a roof were the most beautiful thing in the world. "Come on," Amos said. "We'll get out of this rain, at least." The heavy door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside it was black as pitch and smelled of dust and old wood and rain. Amos had a few matches in his pocket, and he struck one, and its small light showed them rows of broken pews, a collapsed section of roof at the back, leaves and dirt blown across the floor. A forgotten place. A place the whole world had walked away from. And then, as the match burned down toward his fingers, Amos heard something that made his blood run cold. A baby. Crying. He froze. Toby grabbed his hand. And there, from the shadows at the front of the church, near where an altar once stood, came a voice, a young woman's voice, thin with fear and exhaustion. "Please," the voice said. "Please, we're not doing any harm. We've got nowhere else. Please don't put us out." Amos struck another match and moved toward the voice, slow and gentle, and the light fell on the last thing he expected to find in an abandoned church in the middle of the forest. A young woman. No more than 22 or 3. Huddled in the corner, wrapped in a thin shawl, and in her arms, a tiny baby, an infant, only months old. Both of them soaked, both of them shivering, both of them clearly at the very end of their rope. The young woman looked up at the old man with eyes full of terror, and pulled her baby closer, and Amos understood at once that here was someone even more lost than he was. Someone who had also, somehow, been cast out into the cold with a child and nowhere to go. And whatever was broken and grieving and angry in old Amos Carter's heart that night, something in it simply melted at the sight of them. "Easy now," he said softly, crouching down, keeping his voice as gentle as he knew how. "Easy. Nobody's putting anybody out. We're in the same boat, looks like. Just a couple more strays out of the storm." He managed a tired smile. "My name's Amos. This is my grandson, Toby. And you look like you could use a fire even more than we could." The young woman stared at him, hardly daring to believe the kindness. And then slowly the terror in her face cracked, and she began to cry. Her name was Rose. And her story, when it came out over the next hour, was its own kind of heartbreak. She'd been married young to a man who turned cruel. When she'd found herself with child, she'd hoped it would soften him. Instead it had made him worse. And when the baby came, a little girl, he'd flown into a rage that this was another mouth to feed, and one night, drunk and furious, he had put Rose and the infant out of the house and told them not to come back. She had no family. Nowhere to turn. She had been walking and hiding for 3 days, sheltering where she could, slowly freezing, slowly starving, watching her baby daughter grow weaker, certain they were both going to die out here in the cold. And then 2 more lost souls had walked through the door. Amos got a fire going in the old iron stove at the back of the church, which by some miracle still had its pipe intact. He gave Rose the last of the bread from their one bag, and she wept as she ate it, and he pretended not to notice so she wouldn't feel ashamed. He got the baby warm. He got Toby settled. And slowly, as the fire caught and the little church filled with warmth for the first time in years, the 4 of them, an old man, a small boy, a young widow and an infant, for people the world had thrown away, began, without quite meaning to become something. It was Toby who broke the ice, the way children do. He'd been shy of the baby at first, then fascinated, and after a while he crept over and asked Rose, very seriously, what the baby's name was. Lily, Rose told him. And Toby announced with the grave certainty of an 8-year-old, that Lily was the best baby he had ever seen, and that he would teach her everything he knew when she got bigger. Rose laughed. The first laugh she'd laughed in weeks, you could tell, and something in the cold old church warmed that no stove could have touched. Amos watched his grandson, who had been so closed up with grief since his father died, open like a flower in front of that fire, and the old man had to look away for a moment so the others wouldn't see what it did to him. That night, For the first time since the door had slammed behind them, Amos Carter did not feel hopeless. He looked around at the sleeping child, the young mother, his grandson curled up safe and warm, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again. He felt needed. He felt, strangely, almost like a man with a family again. He let himself rest. Just for that one night, he let himself believe they might be safe. He should have known it couldn't last. Because back at the farm, Frank Carter had already realized his mistake, and it was a mistake that meant he could not simply let the old man and the boy walk away. It was 3 days later that the riders came. Those 3 days had been, strange as it sounds, almost happy ones. Amos was a man who had spent his whole life fixing and building, and an abandoned church full of things to repair was, to a man like him, almost a gift. He patched the worst of the roof. He mended pews for firewood and made the sound ones into beds. Rose, it turned out, had a gift for making a place into a home. With nothing but scavenged odds and ends, she made that ruin feel warm and lived in. Toby, who had been so quiet and sad since his father died, came alive with a baby to fuss over and an old church to explore. And the 4 of them ate what Amos could snare and forage, and they sat by the fire at night, and something real and good grew up between them fast. Amos had started to think, God help him, that maybe this was a second chance. A strange, unlikely, cobbled-together family in a forgotten church. Maybe they could make it work. And then, on the 3rd afternoon, Toby came running in from the trees, white-faced. Grandpa. Riders. Coming up the old track. Amos went to the door, and his heart sank. 3 horses, coming through the forest toward the church. And the man in the lead, Amos would have known anywhere. Frank. Now, if you're pulling for this little family the way I am, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what old Amos did when his son rode up to that church is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this story. Now stay with me. Amos stepped out to meet them, pulling the door shut behind him, putting his old body between the riders and the people inside. Frank swung down off his horse with an ugly look on his face. You're a hard man to lose, old man, Frank said. Half the county's got nothing better to do than tell me they saw you and the boy heading into these woods. You've got folks talking, Pa. Talking about how Frank Carter threw his own father and his orphan nephew out in the rain. His jaw tightened. That's bad for me. That's very bad for me. Should have thought of that, Amos said, before you did it. Here's how it's going to be, Frank went on, ignoring him. You and the boy are coming back. Not to the farm. You'll live in the old hand's cabin, out of sight, and you'll keep your mouth shut, and you'll tell anyone who asks that you left of your own free will and I've been generous. That's the story now. He smiled without warmth. Or things get worse for you. A lot worse. And here is where Amos Carter understood something that changed everything. Because he suddenly understood why Frank had really come. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't even the gossip, not really. Frank had come for Toby. You don't care about the talk, Amos said slowly, the truth dawning on him. You need the boy. Don't you? He stared at his son. The farm. It was never yours. It was Daniel's and Daniel left it to Toby. There was a will, wasn't there? A real one. And you destroyed it. But a destroyed will can be proven, if a body knows to look. And as long as that boy is out here in the world, telling people he's Daniel's son, there's a thread hanging loose that could unravel everything you stole. Amos's voice went hard. You don't want us back to be kind. You want that boy where you can control him. Or worse. Frank's face had gone pale, then red. And Amos knew he'd struck the truth dead center. You always did think you were smart, Frank said, low and dangerous. Get the boy. We're leaving. Now. And his 2 hired men started forward. But Amos Carter did not move out of that doorway. No, the old man said. Just that. 1 word. An old man with nothing left, standing between 3 hard men and the children behind him. You'll have to come through me, Amos said. And I may be old, Frank. But I built this body hauling stone and timber for 50 years, and there is nothing, you can do to me that's worse than what you've already done. So come ahead. But know this. There are witnesses now. That young woman in there has seen your face and heard your name. You harm an old man and steal a child in front of a witness, and the story you're so worried about stops being gossip and starts being the rope they hang you with. Frank stopped. Because the old man was right. 3 days ago, Amos and Toby had been alone, 2 people who could simply vanish. But now there was Rose. A witness. Everything had changed. And that was the moment the whole nature of it turned. It wasn't an old man against his son anymore. It was a stolen inheritance, a burned will, a crime that could be proven, and a race now to prove it before Frank found a way to make them all disappear. Frank's eyes went to the church door, calculating. "This isn't over," he said. "You've got no money, no proof, and no time. That will is ashes. And I've got the deed, the clerk, and the law in this county in my pocket." He mounted his horse. "Enjoy your church, old man. Winter's coming. I'll be back for the boy before the first snow. And there won't be any witnesses left to matter." They rode off. And Amos stood in the doorway, shaking, not from fear but from fury, and from the terrible knowledge that Frank was right about one thing. The clock was ticking now. And he had almost nothing to fight with. That night, Amos sat by the fire long after the others slept, and he made a decision. He was going to fight. Not with his fists. He was an old man, and Frank had money and hired guns and a bought clerk. He was going to fight the only way that could actually win. With the truth. And he realized, sitting there, that he had two things Frank didn't know about. The first was a memory. Amos remembered the day Daniel had come home from town, near a year before he died, and mentioned in passing that he'd been to see the lawyer, old Mr. Pembroke, about making things right for Toby, just in case. Frank had found and burned Daniel's copy of the will. But a will drawn up proper by a lawyer has another copy. The lawyer's copy. Filed away in Mr. Pembroke's office in the county seat. If that copy still existed, Frank's entire theft collapsed like a house of cards. The second thing was Rose. A witness, not just to Frank's threats at the church, but someone with no stake in the family, no reason to lie, whose word would carry weight. Frank had been so busy stealing a farm from an old man and a child that he'd never imagined a fourth person walking into the story. So Amos made his plan. It was a desperate one, but it was all he had. At first light, he would set out for the county seat, a hard day and a half on foot, and he would find Mr. Pembroke, and pray the old lawyer still had that copy of the will and the honesty to stand behind it. And he would go, as well, to the circuit judge, who came through the county seat this time of year, and who did not answer to Frank's crooked local clerk. He hated to leave Rose and the children. But Rose, brave girl, wouldn't hear of him not going. "We'll bar the door and keep the fire low and stay quiet as mice," she said. "You go, Amos. You go get what belongs to that boy. We'll be here." So he went. It was the hardest journey of Amos Carter's long life. A day and a half on foot at his age, with barely any food, driven by nothing but the thought of that little boy and what would happen to him if Amos failed. His body screamed at him. His old knees threatened to buckle on every hill. Twice he sat down at the side of the road certain he couldn't go another step, and twice he thought of Toby's face and Frank's words, "I'll be back for the boy before the first snow," and he got back up. There is a strength that comes to a person when everything they love is on the line, a strength that has nothing to do with age or muscle. Amos found it on that road. He didn't stop. He walked through the night, and he reached the county seat the next afternoon, gray-faced and staggering, and he found the office of Mr. Pembroke, the lawyer. And the old lawyer was still there. And he remembered Daniel Carter. And when Amos, hardly able to breathe, asked the question his whole world hung on, whether there was still a copy of Daniel's will, Mr. Pembroke frowned, and went to a cabinet of files, and searched a long, agonizing minute. And pulled out a document. Daniel's will. Signed, witnessed, legal, and clear as day. Everything to Toby. Amos as guardian. Frank named nowhere in it at all. Amos Carter sat down in the lawyer's chair and wept like a child. The rest happened faster than Frank ever could have stopped it. Mr. Pembroke, outraged to learn what had been done, took Amos straight to the circuit judge. Amos told the whole story. The judge, a stern honest man with no love for the crooked county clerk, examined the true will, heard how Frank had forged the deed, and issued his orders within the hour. Frank's claim was fraudulent. The deed transfer was void. The farm belonged to Toby, exactly as Daniel had wished, with Amos as his guardian. And there would be charges, forgery, fraud, and more, for Frank Carter and the clerk who'd helped him. The judge sent men to bring Frank in. They found him at the farm, packing a wagon, having already guessed the old man might be more trouble than he'd bargained for. He didn't get far. And when they told him it was a young widow's word and a lawyer's dusty file and his own father's refusal to die quietly that had undone him, Frank Carter finally understood that the two people he'd thrown into the rain as worthless had been the very ones who brought his whole scheme to ruin. Amos rode back toward the forest in a borrowed wagon, with the law behind him and justice in his pocket, to bring his family home. The farm was Toby's, and Amos brought them all home to it, every one of them. Because here is the thing that had happened in that abandoned church, the thing that mattered even more than the farm. For thrown away people had become a family. And Amos Carter was not about to let that go. Rose and her baby daughter came to live at the farm. It was never anything but proper and good. Amos, near 70, was a grandfather to that little girl, not a suitor to Rose, and the arrangement was simply this: a young woman with nowhere in the world had found a home, and an old man raising a grandson alone had found a daughter to share the load and fill the house with life. Rose ran the household and helped raise the children. Amos worked the land and taught Toby everything he knew. And the farmhouse that had been so full of grief filled up instead with a baby's laughter and a boy's running feet and the warmth of people who had chosen each other. They did one more thing too that first year. They did not forget the church. The little abandoned chapel in the forest had saved their lives, had given 4 freezing, hopeless people shelter on the worst night of their lives, and a place to become a family. So Amos, with Toby working at his side learning the trade, went back and rebuilt it. Fixed the roof, the steeple, the pews, the windows. And word got around of the old church restored in the forest, and of the strange good family that had come out of it, and before long a circuit preacher was holding services there again, and neighbors were coming from miles around, and the forgotten place that the whole world had walked away from became, once more, a place full of light and people and song. Amos would sit in the back pew sometimes, on a Sunday, with Toby beside him and Rose across the aisle bouncing her little girl, and he would think about the night the door slammed behind him. How certain he'd been, standing in that rain, that his life was over. That he was just a used-up old man who'd lost everything. And he'd think about how wrong he'd been. Frank went to prison. Amos took no joy in it, but no guilt either. His son had made his choices, and there is a point past which a man answers for what he's done, kin or no kin. Amos's job was not to save Frank. It was to protect Toby. And that he had done. Toby grew up on that farm, his farm, and grew into a fine young man, steady and kind, so like his father Daniel that sometimes it took the old man's breath away. And Toby never forgot, not for one single day, what his grandfather had done. That a poor old man, thrown out in a storm with nothing, had walked a day and a half on failing legs to fight for a boy's future, and had won it back with nothing but stubbornness and the truth. Years later, when Amos had passed on, full of years and surrounded by the family he'd built, Toby would tell his own children the story. How their great-grandfather had been cast out into the rain, and had found a broken church in the forest, and inside it had found not treasure, not gold but 3 lost souls, a boy, a young mother and a baby, and had chosen, with nothing left to give them a family anyway. He always said it was the best thing he ever did, Toby would tell them. Not saving the farm. Anybody fights for a farm. He meant that night in the church. He meant choosing us. Toby would smile. He said the day everything was taken from him was the day he finally understood what he had. That a family isn't the people you're born to. It's the ones you refuse to leave out in the cold. And out in the forest, the little church still stood, mended and full and warm. The place the whole world had forgotten. The place where a thrown-away old man had found everything that mattered.